Happy Friday. We'll just wait a sec while we fill the hall. For what today I think is a bit more of a working group than an actual discussion, where, as many of you know, we've had in the last week the release of a discussion paper into the Privacy Review Act, which will create the framework for Australia to think about the way that we're going to protect data and set up a system of rules, which we haven't had to this date. So that's what we're going to be here largely talking about today. Welcome everybody. Most of you know me, Peter Lewis, Centre for Responsible Technology. My partners in crime, I sort of point to the screen because they're at the top of mine, Lizzie O'Shea from Digital Rights Watch and Dan Stinton from Guardian Australia. As we do with all these events, we start by recognising that we're all on Indigenous land. I'm on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I'm sure that you will all join me in paying respects to elders past, present, emerging, and recognise that the land we're all on was never ceded. It feels, guys, like this is a bit of a moment when we actually start a process of creating a system of rules around personal information. And we'll put a copy of the discussion paper that was issued from the Attorney General's Department in the chat. It's long and detailed, but it's remarkably accessible if you actually take the time to read through it. And what it's got is a series of issues and questions. And it starts with something that I think is really reassuring, in that they're using the language of personal information rather than the sterile language of data, and that they're really setting out on the process of working out what are the sets of rules that should control, I guess, or inform the way that personal information is collected and used, and whether the current privacy laws, which are probably been on the books since well before surveillance capitalism was a thing, are they still fit for purpose? So if only we had a lawyer. Oh, Lizzie, how much of that did I get wrong? And what's your initial response to the paper? And, what are the areas that are particularly interesting / exciting to you in this discussion paper?
Yeah, I think this really is an opportunity to update the Privacy Act. It's overdue really to better match the challenges that we face in the digital age. So the Privacy Act, it's interesting you talk about the term personal information, because that has always been a term in the Privacy Act, and it sort of perhaps reflects the time of its drafting. But I do think that is what we're talking about here. And when you have conversations about data, or even when you have conversations about privacy, I think privacy covers far too much, I think, to almost be meaningful anymore. You really have to be more specific. And data can remove the potency of what it represents, that it is people's information, but they ought to be entitled to have some control over it. And we need to regulate how companies use it for that reason, because the digital age has opened up the floodgates in terms of the ease in which data can be generated and shared and analysed. So it's a really exciting time, I think, to be getting our teeth into what potential reforms we could introduce. I mean, I've got a lot of kind of concerns about how the Privacy Act is currently drafted. There is one issue that's been a bugbear of mine for a long time, so I thought I might as well start by talking about it. When you share personal information, usually, the Privacy Act requires that you give consent for that. And there's some different rules around depending on what the type of information is. But one of the loopholes, I suppose, is what you'd call it in the Privacy Act, is that you can, a person who's received that information can go on to share it without your consent in most circumstances, if it's been de-identified. And what constitutes de-identification has not always been clear. And what we've seen over recent times is a lot of instances where data sets might be shared publicly, for example, where they're very easily able to be re-identified. So individuals can, through manual processes, be re-identified in that information, even though the person sharing that data set might have made efforts to de-identify people. And that's been a big concern for me, because there's never been proper regulation, I don't think, about what kind of standard we require with respect to de-identification. And this paper kind of discusses potentially stepping up those requirements or regulating de-identified data, and it's got a few options in there that it's putting out there for discussion. And I'll just give you one example, because that might help understand, I think, how significant this issue is. One of our friends of this event. Vanessa Teague, who's a cryptographer, she had made a complaint about a data set that was released for analysis. It was a Medicare data set, so it was a 10% of Medicare billing line items and also PBS purchases, and it made it available. Medicare made it available for public consumption for research, and so people were downloading this data set and using it, and they claimed to have de-identified it. And Vanessa found a way, because she's a talented cryptographer, to re-identify people from that data set. It's actually astonishingly easy to re-identify people, more than I think most people imagine if they're not familiar with large data sets or these kinds of processes of hashing and approaches to cryptography. And so she could find people and identify them in that set, even though Medicare claimed that it had de-identified that data. Now, that was downloaded multiple times, over 1,500 times by various people, including, you can imagine, private companies, all sorts of people. And I think I'd feel pretty violated if that happened to me. And this kind of problem we've seen repeated in lots of instances with a lot actually of government departments who undertake these kinds of activities to make stuff available for researchers. It might be well intended, but it can result in, I think, a very invasive experience of having your data on display for others to consume. And there's no requirement to notify those people that that might have occurred. So that's what happens in public. What I think happens in private all the time between companies is that these data sets are shared. And I mean, I can give you other examples as well. I know I've been talking for a long time, so I'll just give you one quick one. 730 uncovered a little while ago now that the NAB was selling data to a third-party provider who then was on selling that data to a gambling company, Sportsbet. They have a very large budget for advertising. And most people, I think, instinctively would be pretty horrified that a data set would be shared with a gambling company from a bank. That, you know, we don't know much about it because as soon as that was investigated by 730, NAB ended that relationship. But the point, I think, is that kind of de-identification, that de-identified data is a source of revenue for companies that they can share with third-party providers who then share with others. And, you know, very, very difficult to expect that consumers ever imagined that this might have happened to their data. And I think it definitely needs to be fixed.
Thanks, Lizzie. Well, Dan, you're over in the Wild West and you also worked in the Wild West for a long time. This appears to be our attempt to not just sort of imagine the system that should exist, but also deal with some of the issues that have emerged through this period of Wild West data collection and data trading. What in the paper strikes you as being the most meaningful reforms if they see the light of day?
God, where do we start? Look, I might just respond firstly to what you said, Lizzie, just with regards to identity. I can speak with some knowledge around the fact that identity is absolutely traded within private companies for the purposes of targeted advertising. I mean, there are virtually no limitations or not many limitations on that data now. So it's this, I think, hopefully what this review will uncover is how widespread that is and place some limitations around that. But Peter, to answer your question, I mean, look, this is a really welcome and overdue review of the Privacy Act. As Lizzie mentioned, originally drafted in 1988 with a couple of amendments since. So it really is not fit for the digital age in any way. Look, I think the issues paper which has been published is absolutely asking the right questions. I think that the core thing is that consumers, firstly, there needs to be limitations put around the collection and use of consumer data. Consumers need to be able to give consent around how their data is used, and there needs to be really strong enforcement of it. The one concern I have so far is that this is being run out of the Attorney General's office, and as far as I can tell, the Australian Information Commissioner does not have a huge amount of involvement in it. So I hope this is not rushed through, and I hope this is something which is taken seriously because it's a very, very complex area. And I also hope that we don't, as much as GDPR was a step in the right direction, there are many, many things wrong with it. I'm sure we're going to cover some of them today, so I won't go into it now. But I hope that we just don't rush to implement the same system as what GDPR is or CCPA, which also has problems, because there are really significant problems with both of those regulatory frameworks, if you like, and I think Australia can learn the lessons from those and do a much better job. So I'll park that for now because I think we'll probably get into it, but that's what we need to do.
I probably have jumped straight into the meat, and apologies to those who don't live every day reading digital policy papers. So just to sort of, so we had the ACCC inquiry into media. One of its recommendations was to get moving on setting up some frameworks on how information was collected. And then the AG's taken this as a reference from the ACCC. And so this discussion paper goes out. Now, I would imagine if I'm one of the companies that trades in data, I've got a team of policy people and lawyers responding to this to minimise what the law looks like. Who else do you think will be active in responding to this? And then how does the process work from there? There's discussion, review, and then I guess it goes into some form of legislation in the new year. Is that your understanding, Dan?
I think so. Lizzie's probably better placed, given her experience, to comment on this. But yeah, I mean, the issues paper's been published. It's calling for submissions from any interested party up until at the end of this month. That's not a huge amount of time, by the way. I mean, we're really scrambling to finalise our submission in time for that, because, as I said, it's a very complex area. And then I imagine there will be a period of consultation before sort of draft law is passed. But Lizzie, you might be better placed than me to sort of to comment on what you think is going to flow from this.
Yeah, I mean, look, I must say I don't have a huge amount of confidence in the Attorney General for a bunch of reasons, especially after this week. But yeah, of course. So it is then still up to the government to respond to this and decide whether it wants to make it part of its legislative agenda to reform the laws. And for example, in the discussion paper, they talk about a statutory tort for the invasions of privacy. And this is something that's been mooted by so many law reform commissions over the years, you know, lengthy investigations, analysis of what that might look like. And yet we haven't really seen any change as a result of that. So multiple law reform commissions have investigated it and we haven't gotten anywhere. So it's an area of law that has been malnourished, cared for by lawmakers. So I think the onus is on us also to demand change. I think this, part of the reason why I think this is a good moment for it is it comes off the back of kind of a good period now in which people have been watching how tech executives have responded to criticisms of their platforms, of their practices, of things like micro-targeting, of misuse of information, something like Cambridge Analytica. I think there's widespread knowledge that how these companies behave is quite shadowy and not what we'd expect. And then we also see things like, you know, robo-debt, where governments misuse information and don't make a proper effort to respect people's rights in how they might apply these tools of data analysis to us as citizens, as users of government service. So I think absolutely we're going to need to develop that public mandate and advocate for change. They can go through this formal process without amending the laws, of course. I think it's going to be on us as advocates to force that this issue up to the top of the legislative priority list. So, you know, that's on us. And I think we've got a groundswell of support for that project. So we need to translate that into action.
Yeah. And of course, organisations like Digital Rights Watch and Centre for Responsible Technology, we scramble. We don't have the funding base of the big industry players, but I think part of what we were hoping to do today was start that process of collaborating around some of the ideas in this paper. This isn't the first government that's like, and I'll also say credit to the federal government for moving on this. Like, it seems like beyond the politics, there's sections in the public sector that are really serious about moving on some of these issues and sort of not just saying locking in models that have worked overseas, but coming up with something that sort of reflects our political culture. Kimberly's pointed out that there will be a discussion paper out next. So this is really early stages in the process. But talking about processes, Lucy from Digital Rights Watch is on the call too. And I know, Lucy, you've watched up close the development of these codes over in Europe. What advice, I guess, would you be giving activists in Australia, but also the government in terms of how they go about this process? Assuming you're there. That was not seamless. When you're ready, let us know. Are you there? There she is. She just hasn't unmuted herself, so she's mid-sentence.
Oh, you're always blaming the muted person, Peter. I think that's deeply
She should be free now. No, she's still just miming. So I reckon you need to rejoin via internet audio or something there. While we're trying to get Lucy up and running there, so if you break it down, there's a whole discussion around consent and what information should be collected, which I think is, you know, a starting point. We've done a bit of research with Centre for Responsible Technology, which finds that, you know, your average platform you go to seek consent, you need to be, you know, a third year graduate and have an hour and a half to spare sort of to read through all the terms, because you're basically reading an entire legal document. So putting some clear language rings around that's important. There's also specific requirements on consent in kids, which are really important as well, I reckon. The other one, Dan, which is interesting in there, is the political parties exemption. So at the moment, the privacy laws don't really apply to political parties, so they can basically do anything. So I think that's something that the political parties enacted in their own benefit. It'll be interesting to see if that sort of gets any sort of purchase in the review.
Which is absolute madness. I mean, there should be stricter enforcement around political parties' use of personal information, I think, than less. So the fact that there's an exemption in the current legislation, I think, is a fairly gaping hole. Right? And I'd be really surprised, especially in the wake of things such as Cambridge Analytica, if that wasn't cleaned up as part of any future legislation as part of this. But you mentioned consent, Peter. I'm not sure if this is the time, but perhaps it's worthwhile just explaining what consent could look like in a more ideal scenario than what we had under GDPR. So I think, look, most people on the call would realise this, but basically the reason you've seen all these banners popping up on every website that you go to now is largely off the back of GDPR coming in Europe and requiring consumers to consent to various things, but primarily targeted advertising. I mean, that's the bulk of it. I think it's fair to say that it hasn't been hugely successful because it's an incredibly complex area. Consumers don't know what they're consenting to, and there's so many banners everywhere that you go that it just becomes such a hassle. I mean, it's not as bad as reading all the privacy policies that you mentioned, Peter, which obviously no one has time for, but it's not great either. I mean, no one's going to bother to take the time to actually really consider these things properly when they're trying to get onto a website. I think one of the lessons that we can take from GDPR is that hasn't worked very well, and there probably needs to be some kind of central area for consent given, which is then mandated across, or which can then be plugged into every website that operates in Australia. The challenge is going to be... So
you're saying that you decide what your level of consent is, and the sites have to fit your desire rather than the other way around?
Yeah, in theory, it's a great idea. Now, the problem is, and I don't have an answer for this, by the way, so I might be raising this prematurely, but who administers that? Because I don't really want the government administering it either, right? So, and I certainly don't want Google or Facebook administering it. There's a big question, I think, and this probably touches on some of the things that you mentioned, Lizzie, is there probably needs to be a central resource for identity and for consent, which can then flow across all websites that operate and digital businesses that operate in Australia. I'd just be interested if anyone has an idea of who is the ideal, or what is the ideal body to administer a service like that, assuming that everyone thinks it's a good idea. People might not, but that I think is the first point. I think that at the moment, the banners that pop up and the forever sort of clicking yes just so you can get to where you need to go, that hasn't worked. It clearly hasn't worked. And I think that to implement that in Australia would be a mistake.
Well, can you hear me now?
There she is, yay! Hello.
Thanks everyone for bearing with me. I built my own computer from scratch last weekend and it has some problems.
Lucy, that's very impressive.
Thank you. Yeah, well, the functionality is problematic. I think, Dan, good points, but I think you're conflating two pieces of European legislation. And I think that's somewhat unique. And I'll get back to what Peter asked me earlier after, but we do have, in Europe, we have a right to data protection, which is what the GDPR looks after. And then we have a right to privacy, which is what other pieces of legislation like e-privacy, I know this is confusing, but bear with me, look after. And so all of those like cookie banners and all of those like pop-ups that people have to click through is actually, it comes down from the e-privacy legislation, which hasn't been updated since 1996. It's the European cookie law, as they call it. But it actually, I think people abroad have this tendency to understand the European regime as just, it's GDPR is what it is. And they tend to conflate a lot of these frameworks within it. I think as far as GDPR goes, like it was a battle. I think people have an impression that maybe, Europe was so ahead of the thinking, but it was really constellation of there was a political will to update the legislation that was in place from 1996, which was terribly outdated, obviously, in times of Facebooks and Googles and social media and advertising and data brokers, resellers. And then we had a momentum with Greens stepping into the European Parliament. So the Green Party, sort of spearheaded at that time by the Germans, they bargained basically all their political points, literally, because that's how you get a file in the European Parliament. You have points to spend. And it's sort of a gambling game.
Like real political capital.
Yeah. Real political capital got burned to get a hold of this file exclusively. Like they gave up so much to be able to focus on data protection. And it took years of civil society trying to rally behind them and working with them to outvoice the lobbyists. And it wasn't just like the social media companies that came out against it. As you can imagine, they had a lot of opinions, but the advertising industry came out of the woodworks. The online gambling industry came out of the woodworks. Oddly enough, the porn industry came out in support of data protection, privacy. Like there were real strange lines that formed in the negotiations of GDPR, and we were really outnumbered 10 lobbyists for the system to stay that it was to people who wanted change. And so it's not a perfect legislation, but and it wouldn't happen again if it was now, I think, on the table. It just happened to be such a constellation of, Cambridge Analytica really gave it salience, really put it in the news cycles. So it capitalized on, public perception, the Greens being there at that time and being able to ride through it. And obviously now you see maybe in the news occasionally that they are still trying to undermine it, that they still want to change it. I think to Dan's point that it's not working perfectly, part of that is because it's not being properly enforced. The national authorities haven't been given proper funds to actually chase up a lot of those complaints. And I think that's something we're seeing in Australia. The privacy commissioner just similarly under-resourced to exist in this era as a sort of advocate for the people. So that's something, so aside from the legislation, we also have to look at structurally how we're doing it. I think flagging that the AG is the wrong place for it.
Well, Dean did make the point that the current AG is probably not the right person to be talking about consent of all things.
Yeah, there are some shots fired in the chat I see as well.
Yeah. But, that all aside, do you think the GDPR sort of model is what we should be shooting for here? Or is it, should it be a different path that they should be taking?
Well, I think Australia has a different, has different terms of reference because of its, because of a lack.
Because of the merger of the privacy and the collection.
Yeah. So, a lot of people, and I can see the looks as well here, the distinction between data protection and privacy isn't obvious to people, what those rights mean. And so, Europe exists in those terms of reference because we have a charter of human rights. We have a lot of a lot of jurisprudence from the European courts on data protection, on privacy specifically. So the terms of reference in Europe are set within institutional frameworks. And here, that's not the case. I think here, even for privacy, you don't have a good federal level sort of understanding of what that, sorry, not to crap on the system here, but there's a lot of room to grow. So I think it can look really differently, and it should be incredibly ambitious. It should go above and beyond the GDPR because you have such a lacking system in which you're trying to build a framework to protect people and their privacy in this incredibly connected, incredibly digital, incredibly ubiquitous technological sort of environment. So I actually want to see them go 150% on what GDPR was basically, and really make it make sense for Australian individuals in that context. That might be too ambitious, but that's my job as Digital Rights Watch, I think, is to say we need to be here, and then we'll worry about renegotiating where that needs to be over time.
Lucy, if I could jump in, just so I'm clear, in case it wasn't before, I had not as many, probably perhaps not as deep an insight into the beginnings of GDPR that you did, but I'm well aware it was a massive fight. And for what it's worth, I do think it's a step in the right direction. I just think that there's, because, and if nothing else, because it's raised these issues to a level of public consciousness that wasn't there before, and actually made people consider how their personal data is being collected and consider their privacy. And I take your point. I appreciate there's several different laws, and enforcement is often done on a country basis, not on the European basis, and that's part of the problem. I'm aware of those things. My point simply is that the practicalities of its implementation, though, with regards to consent, and there's so many other areas we can cover, but let's stick with consent for a moment, are simply that it hasn't, the practical enforcement of that hasn't worked, because consumers have very quickly just adopted the behaviour that they just say yes to everything and move on without actually considering what they're consenting to. And so my point is, I think that there probably needs to be something that sits separate to just the websites that you visit, where consumers can have more control over what they do with regards to how the data is collected and how it's used. And that's, who administers that, I think, is still a question, as I mentioned, but that's the point I'm trying to make here. Enforcement is a whole other issue, and I agree there needs to be much more teeth on enforcement, both in Australia, but also within Europe, because what we see with GDPR is that all of these companies set up in Ireland, which has really low enforcement as well as low tax rates, and therefore they get away with ridiculous standards because there's no enforcement, even if they are contravening GDPR. So, but anyway, that's a whole other issue. Perhaps we'll come back to that.
So there's another really idea that's been percolating around the notion of data trusts, where a whole bunch of people combined and build power by holding their data in common. That may be a vehicle for those that aren't comfortable with the government department running your consent framework. What do you reckon, Lizzie?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, because I know that this has been thrown around by a lot of kind of progressive and left thinkers about digital platforms, that this is an issue they've considered. Because maybe I could put it in very legal terms, there's a contractual idea of privacy that you can agree to certain things, and there's ways of regulating that. Like, you shouldn't be able to agree to some things. You can limit what's capable of being contracted. But there's also a question around whether that's a model for that is complete for properly protecting people in the digital age. And there are a number of different options for dealing with that. One of them is a data trust, so people pool it there. There's a real question around who would control that, of course, because you could say you don't want the government looking, but I'm not sure I want Google looking either. And so,
what about something like a super fund or something, like an industry super fund, but for your data?
Yeah, well, I mean, maybe a statutory authority that's independent of government. I think you could come up with something that might be preferable that sits in a different space to both government and the private sector. I mean, I also think there's some data that we should be entitled to not share. So, I'm a lawyer. When people come and talk to me, they might tell me things that I could make a lot of money off, but I'm in a fiduciary relationship with them, and it's a relationship of trust because they're vulnerable, and I have an obligation to keep their confidence because I'm part of a regulated profession. There has been experiments legislatively with creating data fiduciaries, so certain data that you share with companies just can't be shared on with others. And there's ways that you can also limit that so that it's effective. And I think there's a real question around what do you do about sharing medical information in particular, where there's many gains to be made from pooling data and analysing it across different individuals. And I think it's possible to think about that, but I think it has to be very tightly held and very tightly managed. And which is, of course, not where we are at the moment. So, I mean, that's why I'm sort of sympathetic to Lucy's point that, starting with consent is a pretty good place to start to understand why some of these proposals shouldn't wash, because it should be about rights and people being treated not as objects, but subjects with autonomy and agency and the right to decide how their information will be used. But I think there is some question around how we can move past just the individual, because there's real gains to be made by sharing that data. But I think it probably has to come with a social license that you develop with those people to make sure they have confidence in the model that's being proposed, instead of by default allowing either the private sector to step in or the government, unscrutinised, unaccountable, from collecting and managing that data themselves. And those, I think, are the kinds of problems we should be discussing at this particular moment.
I guess the good thing about... Sorry, go on, Lucy.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to jump in on the back of that to clarify. GDPR doesn't require consent at all. There's nothing in the GDPR that requires consent for data processing explicitly. And I think that's why I was drawing that distinction between e-privacy, which does require it for cookies and data processing. and actual GDPR. GDPR is a framework that establishes your rights in a system that constantly processes, churns out, and archives sort of data on the internet. You have a right to information, to access, to rectification, to erasure. You have a right to data portability. You have a right to an explanation. There's no right to consent under GDPR. Basically, GDPR was set up to actually govern the framework, to make sure the framework itself is not able to exploit and overly churn people's data. And then within that context, you can individually engage with those companies and say, and that's where the national authorities and the complaints mechanism comes in. You can say they're not respecting the rules, and you can challenge, and you can mount and challenge. But there's actually there's no consent that GDPR thinks through very extensively, because that was not the point. The point was to set up a framework that respects people's rights, that there's a framework where you can challenge when those rights are violated. And then there's a mechanism for the national agencies to fine and actually chase down the companies who are violating your rights, processing your data in ways that it shouldn't be processed, publishing your data in ways in which it shouldn't be published, or transferring it to countries that have horrible laws in some cases. So sorry, Peter, I just wanted to jump in with that because I think Dan touched on it and Lizzie touched on it. I just want to be clear what the EU model is.
That's great context. And I guess our challenge is to think through the Australian situation and not be tied to other models and recognise the peculiarities of our own legal system. One of the things you just mentioned in passing there was cookies, which for those who are uninitiated, to me, if you wanted one reason why we should regulate the internet in any way, the answer has to be cookies, which sounds like a really friendly, sweet and tasty digital thing, but is actually kind of automated stalking. So you go, for those that have clicked it without ever thinking, you go to a site, you click cookies, and then that allows you the site you visit to follow you around to wherever you go next. Now, we're really lucky today. We've got a group of our friends from Monash University's Master of Strategic Comms team who have done some research into cookies. So I thought it was really timely that we invited them to give us their presentation and then maybe bounce off that to talk about where cookies and regulation thereof should fit into this framework. So we've got Samantha and Christina from Monash. So I'm really looking forward to giving them the floor. I've had a bit of a look at their work and it's fantastic, and it's great that they've got a chance to share it with you. So do you guys want to take it away and just sort of tell us a little bit about your thinking on cookies? I'm not sure if you're going to share your screen and take us through a bit of your work or how you want to play it.
Hello, yes, I've actually made a whole slideshow for you, so I hope you're excited.
Totally.
I'll share that now. So yes, Christina and myself will be presenting our industry project to you guys. So I think Christina's going to take it away.
Okay. Sorry.
Ready when you are, Christina.
Sorry, something not right.
Technical issues, 2020, hey?
I know, you just got to go with it. You just got to go with it.
Okay, hi, I'm Christina, and this is Sam. We are presenting Group 11's Cookies Awareness Campaign. Next, please. Hey, Sam. Yeah. To introduce the topic, cookies are small bits of data left on your computer after browsing the internet. They were a simple invention that was used so that a website could remember your position when you respond the web page. Their uses cases are password reminding, Google search suggestions, and most commonly, target advertising. Next, please. And there are currently no regulations on cookies in Australia as they don't collect personal data. However, if enough cookies are collected, they can paint a clear picture about a person with their online purchase, internet searches, and general location. They can make assumptions about a person's gender, earning, political opinions, sexual orientations, and more. Cookies have been a curse of helping political parties locate on the fence voters and increase advertising to them. These harmless cookies are able to do more than remember your password. Next, please. We conducted research through scholars, the media, past and present campaigns, and what the rest of the world are doing, and identified that in Australia. The three major issues needed to be addressed in this campaign for maximum success are as follows. First, there is a disconnect between Australians and their online privacy. Second, digital literacy levels in Australia adults creates a hurdle for users to safely browse the internet. Third, there is the societal disregard for cookies as they are considered harmless because they don't collect personal data. And now I will pass on to Sam, who will discuss our campaign strategies. Hey,
Thank you,
Sam.
Christina. We have identified 4 strategies for our campaign to complete its aims to increase awareness about cookies. Our strategies are a rebrand on cookies, interactive website, a social media campaign, and then an information hub. Firstly, we think that cookies need a tougher reputation. If you Google cookies, you get a biscuit. The first 5 pages of Google searches are about recipes about cookies, all that fun stuff. So we think that why would you take a technological term seriously if it shares fantastic connotations with a sweet biscuit? We believe that using a concept of a trope. So we want to subconsciously rebrand the term to change the way users think about it, which has been very easily used with the coal industry in Australia with the term clean coal. I'm sure you'll remember, which is just an oxymoron in my opinion, but that's fine. So what we plan to do is, we brainstormed some terms, which you can see here. I had a lot of fun with the online dictionary and synonyms. And we have come up with some kind of more like devilly terms that we can kind of maybe use to scare people into actually caring about cookies. We wanted to stay away from the term data, as Peter mentioned earlier. It's just too general. What is data? We need to make it a bit more scary. So web trackers, your personal trackers, online stalkers, something like that is what we're kind of going for. Our second strategy is an interactive website. We found a lot of research that has shown that participation helps users retain knowledge. So we thought a really good way to show the power of cookies is to let users see how much their cookies already know about them. We will offer users a way to view their cookies in an easy to digest format to overcome that kind of technical jargon hurdle. And what it will do, the website will take access to the user's IP address or the cookies on their computer, and will visualize and tabulate that information. We'll collect their data and color code system that's already got a subconscious understanding in most of our minds, which is the traffic light system. So green will represent cookies that are showing little to no personal data, like language preference memory on a website. Orange will represent a medium amount of personal data being found or used, like your browser history, so for targeted advertising and things like that. Red will show a high amount of personal data being used, like geographical location, likely gender, interest, even which cafe you went to last week after your research, and check in on social media. This strategy helps tap into the selfish tendencies in a human, as we can directly show how it will directly affect you as an individual. Our third strategy is a social media campaign. So 79% of Australians have used or have access to use social media from recent census data. So an engaging social media strategy makes sense to target the users where they spend their time and where they can actually see cookies working right in front of their eyes in the form of targeted advertising. Where we use short videos, 15 to 30 second content to keep people interested. Lots of research showing that, the shorter the video, the quicker the point gets across and people maintain that knowledge. We'll use topical references to grab their attention and trigger a 3-step reaction. Number 1, the content will make the users laugh. For example, oh, we saw that you Googled, is Brett Sutton married 5 times last week? What that will then do is they will trigger humor, but that humor will then turn to fear as they think about their own embarrassing internet history and whether they would want that known. Third, this will then prompt them to go and visit our information hub, which is our fourth strategy, and learn more about cookies and then also how to remove them. So our fourth strategy is our information hub. We really wanted to focus on offering a space with content and resources that somebody with any level of digital literacy can use and access. This is important as the intimidating technical jargon is a major barrier for users. And if you start reading something and you don't understand the words in the sentence, you're not going to go further. We will offer videos, fact sheets, scholarly panels, and more to engage any kind of user. Not only can users learn, but they can find solutions. And this is the most important aspect of this hub. It's all good and well to learn about cookies, but you need to be able to action this knowledge. Lastly, our recommendations and outcomes from this campaign is that we have looked into the EU regulations, which have been beaten to death already, so I won't go too much into it. And I think that while they're an excellent start, and they ensure that, as we spoke about, that consent is being given, is it really enough? There's already research stating that the I accept cookies is becoming the new I have read the terms and conditions. Is this consent enough? These regulations don't seem to really be changing the behavior of users or the websites that these users on these cookies. This campaign aims to increase awareness about cookies and by extension, internet safety and privacy. We hope this campaign acts as a stepping stone to future change and regulations to make the internet a safe and fair place for all. Thank you.
Thank you. That's fantastic. My only question is, what's the campaign budget? We should raise a bit of dough, guys. And I forgot. I do love the idea of reframing. Like, this is, really, really important. And the language around web stalking, I think, is absolutely fantastic. As a purveyor of cookie, Dan, I'm sure that most of yours are green. Oh no, you've got to unmute yourself.
My turn this week.
Yeah.
Certainly at the Guardian, we'd probably be amber, to be honest, on the classification that if I caught it quickly, because we certainly still do some tracking. We don't follow people around the internet though. I love the term, by the way, snoops. I think if we refer to these as snoops, that's perfect. That's what we need to get the industry to adopt. I would make one point though. I mean, cookies are kind of going away. Cookies are going away relatively soon anyway. I mean, Safari has already banned them. Firefox has banned them. Chrome is going to ban them by 2023. The problem though, is that all that does is strengthen the surveillance capabilities and the hand of Google and Facebook. Sorry, I know all roads lead back to the platforms every time we have these conversations, but that is unfortunately.
Why is that? Because they'll be the only ones left doing surveillance if we can't do our own snooping.
That's right, because of just how widespread the collection of data is from Google and Facebook's properties. I think we touched on this last fortnight, but just to remind everyone, of the top 1,000 websites in Australia, the ACCC has found that 80% of those websites have Google tracking on them, and Facebook has 40%. So I mean, it's just so widespread how the tentacles, particularly Google's, are on the internet. And this comes back to, by the way, the privacy review, which we started with. I think one of the things that we need to learn, again from GDPR, not to keep banging on about this, but one of the things we need to learn is that it treats the regulatory framework treats pretty much all businesses the same. So even those really large businesses like Google and Facebook don't have any additional obligations on them beyond what a publisher like The Guardian might, for example. And so what that means is that the competition regulator in the UK, off the back of this, the CMA has been making recommendations, if you like, that there needs to be what's called special market status afforded to these platforms, which would restrict the ability of these platforms to be able to collect and aggregate all of that data in one place. So that's I guess another learning that we can take here, is that I think there needs to be purpose limitations put on the collection of consumer data, particularly by Google and Facebook, so that they can't just basically use the fact that cookies are going away just to strengthen their competitive position within the market.
But, again, framing this around snooping just opens it up, because then, you get rid of sort of the DIY snooping and then you go after the industrial snoop industry. Fantastic. Lizzie, what do you reckon? It's a good campaign.
Yeah, totally. I'm all in favour. We just need to come up with a food stuff that makes you sick, that doesn't sound as good as cookies.
Fish milkshake.
I've been fish milkshake. I have been racking my brains. Anyway, this is why I'm not in advertising. Look, I agree with you. I mean, the only thing I'd say about the point that cookies aren't going away is I don't think these are multifaceted problems. And that's why when I mentioned before the idea that we talk about privacy, often what we mean when we say privacy is different things in different contexts. And I think we're going to have to solve that problem probably a different way, the dominance of these platforms. And I am watching very closely what happens in the United States, because there is a wing of the Democratic Party that is pro breaking up of big tech. And it's a real question now, as the Biden administration starts to appoint people, what the role of that part of the party will be in this administration. And I don't think we can necessarily solve all these problems without looking at things like demergers or prevention of mergers in future. And having a different test for those kinds of questions that avoid the centralisation of the web in these companies. So not to undermine anyone's point, but I think we do need to, addressing the problem of cookies, which most people would, I think when they're explained to them, be pretty horrified that they exist, does help improve our critical digital literacy, and then also helps us to ask questions about the whole political economy of the web in ways that will hopefully start at a critical moment when we can hopefully start to answer those questions in lots of different policy areas.
Yeah, that's what I loved about Samantha and Christine's presentation. It's not that you just jump to the solution, but you actually raise awareness to get to the solution, which is the basics of good campaigning, that you reframe the problem, you build an alliance, and then you deliver the action. So, it's the sort of thing that we'll sort of be working to sort of see if we can find a way of developing that up, because I think it might be something for us to do with you guys at Digital Rights Watch, Lizzie. But we just need to find it. And then of course, you need to go, guys, which is the bit that you didn't put in there, you got to go then and raise the funds. And the world of digital philanthropy is a very strange and mysterious place, which I haven't cracked anyway yet. Lucy, you were telling me about the fact that in Europe, while there's sort of ostensibly laws to control cookies, it's a bit of a game of whack-a-mole, and it's sort of not, it's one thing to get to the regulation, but I guess the point that's being made in the chat, the awareness bit is just as much that people are actually pushing back on it, yeah? Now you're trying to unmute again. Oh, second time.
Cool, I can't actually unmute myself, so somebody's gotta click it. Yeah, look, I think in Europe, cookies are super well understood by everyone, just because we've dealt with that banner on the bottom of a web page for 2 decades plus. So people are aware. I think speaking about cookies as a generic term, like there's a lot of differences in cookies and the sort of functionalities and data they protect, which is why we always come back to set up a proper data protection regime, because it will define, like it will so narrow down the scope of what some of these problematic technologies online, the advertising practices are able to do. So I think that's the first step. And then cookies, like a lot of people will like them for things like, if you put things in your shopping bag, you accidentally close a window, and you come back, it's still there. Or like you close your computer overnight and you come back and your stuff is still in your eBay shopping cart. They have a function, they can have a very practical functionality for people. Then there are, of course, cookies that will collect a ton of other stuff. There will be cookies that will collect cross-website data and sort of create. So when you go on a European website and it says, accept just the necessary ones, there are cookies that the website needs to meaningfully function. Then there are cookies that are for advertising and for superfluous purposes, and those shouldn't be there. Arguably the argument that was made in Europe was those shouldn't be there at all. But as I said, it's a really outdated regulation. So it's morphed into this horrible cookie law and a sort of meaningless consent, where I think it's what we really want to see is, unless you need it to run the website, don't track anything else. Like there's no need for, if I'm browsing a website for me to suddenly get an email an hour later to say, hey, you left the website. Like, why do you have my email? That's not appropriate. Like, if I choose to come back, I should choose to come back. And so there's all of these, I think, nuances. The system, especially in Australia, is really built to capitalize on the fact that there are no protections and no definitions. The European system on this isn't perfect. But I think and I think that's what we need to realize, is that, you know, the technology is ever changing. And I think Nicola pointed this out earlier in the chat as well, that advertisers, unless you actually crack down on the functionality, the technology, whether it's cookies or something else, is almost immaterial, because they'll figure out a different way to do that kind of traffic tracking and data collection. Because it's really, sorry, and just last point, we do focus a lot on the platforms, and I don't want to downplay the horrible, like, targeted advertising that Facebook does, that Google does. There's a really huge international issue of data brokers and like these huge like aggregation farms and companies like Palantir, and even security companies like World Check Database, who like capitalize on buying these sort of huge database of people's information and then use it to like provide intelligence consulting and stuff like that to governments. And we have no control and no checks over that whatsoever. So it on the face of it, I'm happy to hammer on the companies, but like there are really big structural issues globally that need to be addressed.
Thanks, Lucy. And Simon's just saying in the chat, you can actually go and have a look at how many cookies you've accumulated. It looks like you've got a very overflowing jar there, Simon. Last topic, and almost a cautionary tale on tech regulation. While the US elections were on over the last couple of weeks and the presidential results probably a good thing for humanity, there was a particular vote in California, one of these citizen propositions. It wasn't the legalization of magic mushrooms in Oregon, but it was a successful, effective overturn of regulating the share driving employment market in California. And I'll put a link to a pod in there, but it just shows how effective campaigning from the bad guys can go. And if you listen to the pod I've just put in there, it's really interesting. They Uber and Lyft and the others basically ran a campaign that looked very much like a Bernie Sanders style campaign. I think they used the language of feel the burn and that sort of thing as well, to convince people that it was that they were freeing up the share driving market, and they were giving support to drivers, and they're actually taking rights away. Lizzie, this is a constant battle, isn't it? Just a bit of legislation isn't the end of the story.
Yeah, I think this is a pretty alarming precedent. It's a corporate sponsored bill, so they spent nearly $200 million on campaigning to get this proposition up. What had happened is that there'd been a ruling that these companies owed gig workers rights and responsibilities as employees, so that came with certain entitlements and the like. And the aim of this proposition was to strip them away. It actually also instills a requirement that to overturn this law, you need a 7/8 majority to do so. So locking it in from a legislative perspective, the companies are thrilled. Their price of their shares went up. They're now talking about how they can roll this out nationally, so to do it in other states and potentially internationally as well. They want to spend, as their CEO put it, less time in court and more time, I suppose, the implication being writing their own laws to suit them. So it's a very troubling precedent. I think what is on display, I have to say, though, is probably what happens a lot of times behind closed doors, where the well-oiled machine of lobbyists on behalf of tech companies are there working with legislators and lawmakers to implement laws that suit them. And I think we always need to keep that in mind. They do spend billions of dollars on lobbyists in recent times because they're aware that changes and reforms are coming, and this is how they seek to control it. So it's pretty disappointing. It's pretty alarming to see how easily the democratic process can be manipulated by money. But I suppose the salutary lesson to remember that that's probably something that's a constant part of our system, and we need to keep that in mind and hold our lawmakers to account as well when they get subjected to pressure from lobbyists.
And Dan, of course, we've got our own digital big tech lobby in Australia, Digi, who are currently have volunteered to write the industry code for disinformation. So that sense that you're up with, and I guess when you're dealing on behalf of the Guardian, you're often dealing with the lobbyists of the big tech companies, and you probably feel like you're a bit under-resourced as well in comparison.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably an obvious point, but it's it's even if all of the publishers got together, be that News Corp, Nine and us, and we haven't been on this code much, to be honest, we haven't really had a lot of collaboration, but our efforts pale in significance compared to the lobbying efforts of the larger platforms. Sorry to bring them up again. So yeah, I mean, I think it's a world which you're kind of always outgunned. I'm encouraged, by the way, that it looks like the digital platforms code is, despite the lobbying efforts of the platforms, it does still seem like it's going to be progressing relatively soon. So watch this space.
Excellent. On that note, look, thanks guys from Monash for joining us today. I think another group will be here in a fortnight's time. That was absolutely fantastic. And thanks, Magda, for organising all that. I think we've all got a lot of work to do to sort of get a bit of a common front on how we approach this privacy paper, but I'll be talking to you guys offline, and anyone else that wants to be part of that process. We'll sort of fight in the mail out. We'll let people know what the next steps are. It's a couple of minutes to 2. Let's call time. Have a great weekend, everyone, and thanks for being part of it.